Hey guys, tonight we wander through echoing stone corridors, past flickering torchlight, and into the opulent but utterly revolting world of medieval kings. You stand beneath soaring arches painted with gold leaf, velvet drapes swishing around you, and think, wow, royal life must be the pinnacle of comfort. Except, you're also scratching at flea bites on your ankles, gagging on the musky scent of sweat-soaked ermine cloaks, and ducking away from the suspiciously damp straw scattered under the king's majestic chair. You're about to learn that the real horrors of medieval kings weren't just bloody wars or poisonings, but the fact that their thrones were often crawling with life, and not the good kind. You probably won't survive this, so, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge toward a throne room so bright and gilded that it's practically screaming royalty, yet the closer you get, the more a sour odor hits your nose. That magnificent wooden throne, intricately carved with lions and saints, is padded with velvet cushions stuffed with, well, let's say the local upholstery tech was not exactly on point. Those cushions often harbored fleas, lice, and other creepy crawlies. Mainstream historical records confirm that medieval castles were epicenters for pests, thanks in part to the warmth of fires and the tightly packed crowds. Even kings weren't safe. Edward I of England, for instance, famously kept moving from castle to castle, not only for politics, but partly to avoid the infestations building up in any one place. Historians still argue whether Edward was more driven by military strategy or sheer disgust for the filth accumulating around his throne. You scratch your neck instinctively as you imagine a crown sliding over matted hair. Remember that flea problem we mentioned? The noble class wasn't immune. One quirky tidbit historians love is how Henry VIII reportedly changed shirts 3 or 4 times a day because of lice. Sounds high maintenance, until you realize he still probably smelled like a medieval gym locker. As you edge closer to the throne, your slippers crunch on straw scattered across the floor. Yes, that straw was there to soak up mud and other royal byproducts. The royal court might have looked dazzling to visiting dignitaries, but underfoot, it was a soggy, bacteria-riddled mess. You wonder how anyone kept their fancy slippers clean. Short answer, they didn't, and let's talk about the magnificent tapestries draping the walls. They're not merely decorative, they're there to block drafts, muffle echoes, and cover up stains, mold, and suspicious splatters that nobody wanted to scrub off cold stone. One chronicler noted that during the reign of Louis IX, entire sections of tapestry were replaced simply because the smell became unbearable. You can practically hear your modern dry cleaner screaming in horror. Historians still argue whether these elaborate wall hangings were more about insulating royal privacy or simply hiding all the gross stuff kings didn't want foreign envoys to see. Either way, you'd better keep your eyes peeled. A jolt runs through you as you remember tales of medieval kings developing mysterious skin lesions and rashes, blamed on poor hygiene, parasites, or the layers upon layers of heavy fabrics they wore. Imagine baking in a fur-lined robe while your skin can't breathe. Henry V reportedly suffered from pustules so severe that courtiers avoided approaching him. Medieval physicians, of course, suggested a refreshing bloodletting session. Because why not? You reach for the throne's armrest, thinking maybe you'll try sitting on royal authority for a minute. But a wave of ammonia hits your nostrils. Royal thrones often doubled as toilets, hence the phrase, sitting on the throne. Some medieval seats came with a discreet chamber pot beneath. That's right, the king might be issuing royal decrees, while also dealing with personal business. Talk about multitasking. It's enough to make you question whether medieval kings ever truly felt majestic. One moment, they're receiving ambassadors, the next, they're shifting on cushions alive with fleas. In a room that reeks like a latrine, you step back, trying not to breathe too deeply. The echoes of regal voices bounce off vaulted ceilings, while rats scuttle along the beams overhead. At least the rats had the decency to stay up high. Usually, still, the allure of those shimmering thrones persists. Gilded lions, fleur-de-lis, and Latin inscriptions proclaim royal power. Even if, beneath all the splendor, the king might be itching, stinking, and swatting away pests, you glance back at the door, half tempted to run. But then again, you're curious. What else could possibly be lurking behind all this royal pageantry? You'd be right to wonder. Because this was merely the surface of royal life, and the truth is, if you think the throne room is gross, wait until you join the king for dinner. You barely manage to pry yourself away from the throne room's suspicious aromas when a herald in blindingly bright robes claps his hands and calls you to supper. You follow, half curious, half afraid, into the cavernous great hall where flickering torches cast shadows over trestle tables piled high with steaming platters, and let's be real, you're hungry. All that scratching and gagging in the throne room has worked up an appetite. But as you inch closer, you're hit by a wave of smells that's complicated. Some savory, some sweet, some suspiciously reminiscent of wet dog. Tonight, you're dining with kings, and discovering that royal meals were culinary spectacles capable of delighting the senses, and occasionally killing their hosts, you plop yourself onto a bench, careful to avoid splinters. Platters arrive, carried by servants who look perpetually on the verge of dropping something. A roasted peacock lands in front of you, feathers reattached for visual flair, its beady eyes staring at you like it knows your browser history. Mainstream historians confirm that medieval royal banquets were designed to impress, and sometimes shock. Whole animals were roasted, redressed in their own feathers or scales, and served looking almost alive. A chronicler in the court of Charles VI of France described a meal where live birds flew out of a giant pie, sending guests shrieking and probably traumatized for life. Historians still argue whether these avian acrobatics were primarily entertainment or subtle power plays, a way for kings to say, "Look what I can make happen with my money." You poke at a jellied dish quivering in a pewter bowl. It's called aspic, a savory gelatin made from boiled bones and animal bits. Medieval kings adored aspic for its elegant shimmer, though to modern eyes, it looks like something you'd scrape out of a clogged drain. A quirky tidbit, Richard II's chefs documented over 20 types of aspic in one banquet menu, some dyed bright colors with herbs and even crushed insects. Bon appetit, your neighbor leans in and whispers about the royal wind. Apparently, kings often suffered spectacular bouts of gas after these lavish spreads. Chroniclers delighted in recording how Henry VIII's great surfeit of meats often left him plagued by stomach pains and, let's say, atmospheric disturbances. Imagine an entire great hall falling silent because His Majesty just dropped a royal trumpet solo. You stifle a laugh, though part of you wants to leave. Yet the king himself is beckoning you closer, his cheeks flushed with wine. Now the servants bring out spices so precious they're practically currency. Cinnamon, saffron, nutmeg, all imported at staggering cost. It's easy to forget that medieval cooking wasn't just about taste, it was status. Only a king could afford dishes loaded with rare spices, announcing his wealth to any visiting dignitaries. But here's the dark side, some of these exotic dishes turned out lethal. Food poisoning stalked royal tables more often than assassins did. Poor storage, bad meat, or simply unfamiliar ingredients led to many a fatal dinner. Historians still argue whether King John of England died partly from dysentery caused by contaminated food. In any case, medieval kings faced the real possibility of being done in not by daggers, but by dinner. A servant places a cup in your hand. It's hippocras, spiced wine sweetened with honey and strained through a cloth. It's delicious, but also a potential hazard. Those fancy spices mask the taste of spoilage or poison. Medieval kings lived in constant fear of their wine being tampered with. One French king even carried his own personal cupbearer everywhere, like a medieval security detail. You sip cautiously, eyes darting around for suspicious courtiers. It's exhausting being royal, then the next course arrives, a towering pie. It's so big it could double as a storage ottoman. Inside, you're half expecting another flock of birds. But instead, out spills a creamy stew of eels, prunes, and raisins. Medieval cooking loved that sweet salty clash. Though your modern taste buds are deeply confused, you take a bite. It's interesting. A flash of cinnamon, followed by something earthy that tastes like pond water. You're not sure if you've just eaten a delicacy or the king's fishing bait. All around, courtiers shovel food into their mouths with alarming speed. Forks existed, but weren't widely used in many royal courts yet, so fingers it is. Which leads to another delight. The royal tablecloths, after a feast, resembled modern-day paper towels at a kid's birthday party. Henry VIII supposedly wiped his greasy fingers on the velvet drapes. Talk about royal privilege, your belly's starting to feel a bit precarious. You recall tales of fatal flatulence, because medieval kings sometimes quite literally died of indigestion. Philip the Fair of France reportedly succumbed to a sudden stroke after a gluttonous meal, though historians still argue whether it was purely medical or suspiciously convenient for his rivals. It dawns on you that in the medieval world, kings were surrounded by endless luxury, but one bad oyster or suspiciously green slice of beef could bring them down faster than a conspiracy ever could. So, if you ever attend a royal banquet, be polite, but maybe stick to the bread, and remember, if dinner was hazardous, just wait until you learn what lurked beneath those glittering royal crowns. Your stomach still churns from the eel pie as you stagger from the great hall into a private chamber where sunlight slants across jewel-crusted crowns laid out on velvet cushions. They're breathtaking, gold filigree twisting into shapes of lilies, crosses, or dragons, all ablaze with rubies and sapphires that sparkle like paparazzi flashes. You lean closer, hypnotized by the way colored gems catch the light. For a fleeting moment, you wish you were royal, strutting around with a solid gold hat on your head. Then a breeze wafts through the chamber, carrying a whiff of something musty and yeasty. You blink. Did the crown just smell? Welcome to the world where the dazzling regalia on kings' brows hid some truly disgusting secrets. You step closer, peering into the delicate filigree work. Historians know that royal crowns weren't just heavy, they were literal breeding grounds for skin conditions. All those layers of velvet lining, leather bands, and thick metal trapped heat and sweat. Over time, the royal scalp turned into a sauna no five-star spa would ever endorse. Mainstream historical records confirm that European kings often suffered from persistent skin infections and sores along their hairlines, especially after long coronation ceremonies under hot church candles. Edward III of England reportedly experienced raw patches on his scalp from wearing his crown too long during state occasions. Historians still argue whether this was purely physical or exacerbated by the stress of royal duties. As you inspect the glittering circlets, a servant casually mentions a quirky tidbit: medieval barbers doubled as lice pickers. Imagine kneeling before a king, delicately combing through his hair for parasites while trying not to insult his royal dignity. Henry IV of England paid his personal barber handsomely for both haircuts and discreet delousing services. You shiver at the thought of a gold crown pressing lice deeper into royal follicles. Then you learn about the padding. To soften the hard metal, many crowns were lined with plush fabrics, but those fabrics were often stuffed with wool or horsehair, prime real estate for lice and mites. One chronicler claimed that a certain king, though he didn't dare name names, scratched his scalp so violently during a feast that flecks of dried skin fell into his goblet. Cheers to that. Moving on, you spot the crown of Saint Wenceslas gleaming nearby. It's studded with sapphires and one giant ruby that looks big enough to stop traffic. But even sacred regalia wasn't safe. Some coronation crowns were believed to carry curses. For instance, the Iron Crown of Lombardy was rumored to bring ruin to rulers who wore it unworthily. Napoleon Bonaparte supposedly touched it lightly instead of donning it fully during his coronation, just in case. Historians still argue whether such curses were political rumors or genuinely feared supernatural threats. Of course, not every king wore a crown daily. Many kept them locked in royal treasuries, too valuable for regular use. Instead, they opted for lighter circlets or hats. But coronations were the big exception. During these marathon ceremonies, kings sometimes wore crowns weighing over 10 pounds for hours. You try balancing a small watermelon on your head and see how that goes. Some kings developed migraines from the constant pressure. Chroniclers mention Charles V of France suffering blinding headaches after a coronation. Naturally, medieval doctors prescribed bleeding and herbal poultices, which probably helped as much as a good slap to the forehead. You lean closer to a crown, marveling at the tiny hinges hidden within its band. Many crowns were adjustable because medieval kings' heads weren't all one size, nor did hair always cooperate. A quirky tidbit: one Spanish crown had a removable velvet liner that could be swapped if it got too sweaty or, well, infested. Medieval multitasking at its finest. As you glance around the chamber, you notice a dusty cabinet containing ointments. A servant explains that kings and queens applied scented balms to soothe scalp sores or mask any suspicious odors wafting from under their crowns. Fragrant resins like frankincense were prized, though one chronicler noted that a certain ointment left a king's hair greasy and rank. Imagine your shampoo leaving you smelling like a medieval food court. Historians still argue whether these scented balms were genuinely medicinal or simply medieval attempts at royal PR. Because if a king smelled nice, surely he was divinely favored. Suddenly, a shaft of sunlight hits the jewels just right, casting rainbows across the stone floor. For a moment, you forget about the parasites and pustules, swept up in the sheer artistry of medieval goldsmiths. Then you remember that these crowns, so dazzling and holy, were often tools of oppression. Wearing them meant enforcing taxes, crushing rebellions, and sending armies to die. Each gem might as well be a bloodstain, and all the while, the king scratched away under his regal bling, plagued by lice, infections, and the constant terror of losing his head, figuratively and literally. So you step away, a little less enchanted. Because if crowns could hide horrors, imagine what secrets lingered in the very air of royal palaces. And speaking of air, you're about to discover why medieval power smelled far worse than it looked. You stagger from the crown chamber into a broad stone hallway, gasping for a lungful of fresh air, only to find that, in a medieval palace, fresh is a relative term. Your nose wrinkles immediately. There's a ripe stench rolling through these corridors, an unholy cocktail of wet wool, body odor, old food, and something distressingly close to a sewer. Welcome, dear listener, to the aromatic horrors lurking behind royal power. Because medieval kings didn't just rule over lands, they ruled over entire ecosystems of stink. You keep walking, eyes watering, as a servant rushes past you carrying a silver chamber pot. You quickly realize he's not headed for a bathroom. There is no bathroom. Instead, castles had garderobes, small closets built into thick walls, with a hole that dropped waist straight down the outer face of the castle or into cesspits below. Mainstream historians note that royal castles often had multiple garderobes, some quite fancy, but the reality was grim. Gravity was your only flushing system, and wind direction determined whether the royal aroma wafted back inside. Historians still argue whether elaborate stone chutes were more effective than simply using a bucket and tossing its contents out a window. A quirky tidbit: the term garderobe literally means guarding the robes, because nobles believed hanging garments in these smelly spaces kept moths away. Apparently, moths dislike ammonia as much as the rest of us. So next time you're tempted by medieval cosplay, remember some outfits were seasoned in toilet fumes. You turn a corner and nearly gag as a wave of musty air hits your face. Medieval kings wore layers upon layers of clothing, linen undershirts, wool tunics, velvet robes, all held together with ornate belts. These fabrics soaked up sweat and grease, then rarely got washed. Laundry was labor-intensive, water was scarce, and delicate fabrics risked damage. So even a king might wear the same tunic for weeks. A chronicler once described how King Louis IX of France's robes grew stiff with grime during a campaign. Historians still argue whether this was a sign of holy piety or simply poor laundry logistics. Either way, you'd rather not sit next to him at dinner. Your nose protests as you pass a chamber lined with tapestries. Those gorgeous wall hangings trap not only cold drafts but also layers of dust, mildew, and the occasional rodent nest. Some tapestries were so filthy that visitors complained of coughing fits. Royal stewards periodically beat the fabric with sticks in an attempt to de-dust them, sending clouds of allergens billowing through the halls. You cover your mouth, coughing, as you peer through an open door. Inside, servants scrub rushes and straw scattered on the floor. These were medieval flooring solutions, natural materials sprinkled with dried herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask odors. Yet after weeks of spillage, animal droppings, and tracked in mud, those rushes turned into a bacteria banquet. Henry VIII reportedly replaced his rushes every few months. Some kings didn't bother for years. You do the math. Historians still argue whether these herbal rushes genuinely improved hygiene or simply created a rustic perfume over festering filth. Either way, you're convinced medieval interior designers should have added air freshener to their blueprints. Pushing onward, you reach the kitchens. The air's warmer here, though that's not entirely comforting. The medieval kitchen was a hot, smoky labyrinth where fires roared under roasting spits and cauldrons bubbled with mysterious stews. Grease coated the walls, mingling with smoke and the pungent tang of singed hair from hapless kitchen boys. A quirky tidbit: in some royal kitchens, the grease grew so thick it was scraped off and sold as tallow for candles or soap. Congratulations, your nightlight may once have been royal pork drippings. You notice royal chefs ladling out sauce with long-handled spoons. They're also sweating buckets. Medieval kings demanded rich sauces loaded with spices, which helped disguise questionable meat. But these spicy concoctions filled kitchens with stinging fumes. Chroniclers describe how chefs wiped tears from their eyes as they prepared dishes fit for a king, and cleared entire rooms simply by dropping too much pepper into a boiling pot. Historians still argue whether the extravagant spices were truly for taste or mainly to cover up the reek of not-so-fresh meat. Considering how often kings suffered digestive distress, you're leaning toward the latter. Outside the kitchen door, you pause to wipe your eyes and take in the vast castle yard. Even here, the stench persists. Livestock huddled near palace walls, piles of waste from kitchens and stables accumulated in corners, and rain simply spread it around like a grim medieval cologne. A chronicler once claimed that King Richard II of England complained of the abominable stench of the air near Westminster. Imagine being a king, powerful enough to rule nations, yet powerless to escape the wafting perfume of dung, and here you thought kings lived in pristine luxury. The truth? Medieval power came soaked in sweat, marinated in spices, and thoroughly perfumed with, well, everything else. As you stagger back indoors, your eyes watering, you realize there's another, far deadlier hazard lurking behind castle doors. Because for all the filth and stench, the real terror often arrived quietly in the night, bearing whispers of betrayal and gleaming steel. You stumble back into the castle, wiping your nose, convinced that your sense of smell may never recover. But before you can fully process the bouquet of royal funk, a servant grabs your sleeve and hushes you into a shadowy corridor. Keep your voice down, he whispers, glancing over his shoulder. They're plotting again. Your pulse quickens. Because in the world of medieval kings, danger didn't just come from battlefields. The true terror often crept in under cover of night, daggers glinting in candlelight, goblets laced with poison, and trusted courtiers whispering betrayal while pretending to fluff the king's pillow. You creep forward, slippers silent on cold stone. Mainstream historians remind us that medieval monarchs lived in constant fear of assassination. Kings were surrounded by people whose loyalty could turn on a dime, family members with rival claims, nobles jealous of royal favor, or even foreign agents embedded in the palace staff. Historians still argue whether some kings were genuinely paranoid or perfectly justified in suspecting everyone around them. A quirky tidbit: in some courts, kings slept in elaborate contraptions called state beds, surrounded by heavy curtains and sometimes even guarded by bodyguards who dozed at the foot of the bed. Charles VI of France, who suffered from bouts of madness, insisted his chamber be locked from the inside every night, though sometimes he forgot he'd locked it, leading to frantic hammering for someone to let him out. You inch into a dimly lit chamber where a group of nobles leans close around a table. Maps lie spread across the wood, candle wax dripping onto a suspiciously dark stain. The men lower their voices as you approach, and one slides a dagger back into his sleeve. No big deal. Totally casual palace chit-chat, whispers swirl about poisons derived from plants like hemlock, belladonna, and aconite, deadly toxins that could slip unnoticed into a cup of wine. Kings often traveled with personal tasters, poor souls whose job was basically, drink this and let me know if you die. Consider Edward II of England. Historians still argue whether he met a grisly fate through political murder or simply perished from illness. Chroniclers delighted in lurid rumors, including an alleged method of murder involving a red-hot poker. But evidence remains murky, leaving modern scholars debating whether it was real or just juicy palace gossip. Your eyes widen as you spot a tiny vial in one nobleman's hand. It's filled with something green and viscous, swirling ominously like a medieval lava lamp. Even the smallest dose might be enough to drop a king mid-sentence. Another group huddles closer, plotting more physical methods. Short daggers perfect for slipping between ribs, or slender swords concealed under voluminous cloaks. It's all very cloak and dagger, minus the subtlety. A quirky tidbit: in the Byzantine Empire, emperors often employed a special elite force called the Varangian Guard, composed mostly of fierce Vikings, who served as personal bodyguards precisely because they were foreign and less likely to be bribed by local nobles. Nothing says "sleep tight" like trusting giant Norsemen with axes beside your bed. You tiptoe through the room, pretending to be invisible. Yet everywhere you turn, the palace is crawling with spies. Servants, musicians, even jesters carried messages. One jester was famously executed in Hungary for revealing state secrets mid-performance. Imagine dying because your punchline went too far. Historians still argue whether royal jesters were genuinely fools or clever informants planted to observe and report back to the king. Either way, you'd better watch what you whisper near the guy wearing bells on his hat. Suddenly, a door creaks open. A servant enters carrying a goblet of wine. Everyone freezes. Poison drinks were such a terrifying reality that kings sometimes refused to drink from communal cups altogether. Henry VIII reportedly grew so suspicious he refused any food or drink prepared out of his sight, leading to entire new protocols for royal kitchens. You inch closer, trying to peer into the goblet. It looks innocent enough, but so did many a lethal concoction. A chronicler once noted that, the king did drink wine that made him sweat and tremble mightily, and that was just the good days. Your skin crawls as you realize how impossible it must have been to sleep peacefully as a medieval king. Enemies within the family, ambitious nobles, and foreign agents, all plotting while the king slumbered, possibly snoring, behind velvet curtains, and then there were nighttime betrayals from closer quarters still. A wife with her own political alliances. A brother nursing a grudge over inheritance. Even royal children, groomed by factions eager to use them as pawns. It's enough to make your pillow feel like a potential murder weapon. A quirky tidbit: some kings reportedly slept in different rooms each night to keep assassins guessing. One French monarch kept a secret spiral staircase hidden behind a panel, just in case he needed to bolt mid-slumber. Historians still argue whether all these security measures were overblown or genuinely essential. But judging from the number of mysterious royal deaths in medieval chronicles, you're leaning toward essential. So as you slip away from the conspiratorial chamber, your heart pounds. Because if palace walls could talk, they'd whisper tales of betrayal and blood, and as horrifying as plots and poison might be, they're nothing compared to what happens when medieval medicine tries to save a royal life. You hurry away from the conspirator's chamber, pulse hammering, only to round a corner and collide with the unmistakable smell of medieval medicine. It's an aroma equal parts herbs, rancid fat, and something suspiciously metallic. A smell that says, hey, at least we tried. Because in the days of medieval kings, even the grandest monarch could be felled by a cough, a fever, or an infected wound, and the treatments might be worse than the disease. You tiptoe into the royal bedchamber, where flickering candlelight reveals a terrifying sight. The king lies pale and sweating under thick velvet blankets, his lips cracked, eyes glassy. And surrounding him are a flock of medieval physicians, all muttering Latin and brandishing instruments that look like medieval torture devices. Mainstream historians confirm that kings were often treated by court physicians whose methods mixed ancient theory with trial and horrifying error. Bloodletting, purging, and mysterious poultices were standard fare. Historians still argue whether these men were earnest professionals doing their best, or charlatans who simply made things worse. A quirky tidbit: the royal physician's prestige was immense, but so was the risk. If the king died under your care, you might find yourself accused of murder, or at least permanently unemployed. You inch closer, trying to keep your breathing quiet. One physician steps forward holding a brass bowl, while another readies a knife. They're about to bleed the king, convinced that draining bad humors will rebalance his body. You can't help picturing medieval kings resembling leaky water balloons after repeated treatments. The physician finds a vein and slices it open, catching the dark stream in the bowl. The king winces and groans. Everyone else pretends this is completely normal, but let's not forget leeches. Medieval kings endured countless sessions where fat, wriggling leeches latched onto royal skin to drink their fill. A chronicler describes how Charles V of France was made pale and weakened by repeated leeching. The rationale? Leeches supposedly extracted poisoned blood or excess humors. You suppose that's one way to lose a few pounds. Historians still argue whether leech therapy was genuinely effective or simply a medieval placebo that gave doctors something to do. Moving around the bed, you spot another royal horror show: pus. Lots of it. Royal wounds festered without antibiotics, turning minor injuries into gaping sores. Medieval surgeons often believed that laudable pus was a sign of healing. If your wound oozed, it meant your body was expelling poison. A quirky tidbit: in the royal court of Aragon, the court physician kept a jar of dried pus scabs as a diagnostic tool. Medieval medicine, not exactly the field you want to intern in. The king moans as another doctor slathers a thick herbal paste over his lesions. The concoction smells like garlic, vinegar, and regret. Some medieval recipes included crushed pearls, precious stones, and even ground-up mummy dust imported from Egypt. Because if it's expensive and exotic, it must be medicine, right? You notice the royal apothecary hovering near the bed, clutching tiny pouches filled with powdered substances. He explains, in hushed tones, how he makes pills from herbs like wormwood, valerian, and mandrake. Mandrake, incidentally, was rumored to scream when uprooted and cause madness if mishandled. Perfect ingredient for your bedtime Tylenol. Historians still argue whether these herbal concoctions offered genuine relief or simply sedated kings long enough to stop them from complaining. A physician leans over the king, sniffing his breath like a medieval breathalyzer. They believed bad breath hinted at internal imbalance or approaching death. Chroniclers recorded how royal physicians would solemnly declare a king doomed purely because his mouth reeked foul. Medieval diagnoses: come for the science, stay for the halitosis. Another quirky tidbit: King Henry IV of Castile reportedly developed a tumor so large that doctors tried to drain it by inserting heated metal rods. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well. The chamber grows even tenser as the king's breathing grows ragged. Physicians argue among themselves, voices rising: bleed him more. Apply cold compresses. Summon the barber surgeon. You half expect someone to suggest sacrificing a goat just to cover all bases. Historians still argue whether medieval royal medicine prolonged life or merely prolonged suffering. Judging by the king's glazed expression, you're leaning toward the latter. At last, the doctors retreat, leaving the king wheezing softly beneath a mound of blankets. The royal chamber stinks of blood, sweat, vinegar, and burnt herbs. Servants whisper prayers under their breath. You feel a pang of sympathy for medieval kings, all that power, yet utterly helpless before the smallest bacteria, because under those gilded crowns, kings were as mortal as anyone, just with more elaborate funerals when things went sideways. And speaking of ceremonies, you're about to witness how coronation rituals could be as terrifying as any plague. You tiptoe from the king's sick room, your brain overloaded with visions of bloodletting bowls and leech fangs. But there's barely time to catch your breath before a herald in bright robes grabs you by the elbow. Quick, he hisses. They're preparing the anointing oils. And suddenly, you're swept along in a swirl of incense, solemn chanting, and glittering vestments, because tonight, you're front row for one of the most powerful and perilous events in any medieval king's life, the coronation. On the surface, it's all breathtaking spectacle. Candles flare against stained glass windows, choirs chant Latin hymns, and the king, clad in shimmering robes, approaches the altar. But behind the pageantry lurks a world of fear, superstition, and the constant dread that one slip of oil might doom an entire reign. Mainstream historians confirm that the coronation wasn't merely a political event, it was a deeply religious rite. The anointing with holy oil transformed a mortal man into God's chosen ruler. This divine rite gave kings the supposed authority to command armies, levy taxes, and occasionally chop off heads with moral impunity. Historians still argue whether this religious pageantry was truly spiritual or simply medieval propaganda in fancy hats. A quirky tidbit: some coronation oils were guarded so zealously they were stored in hidden crypts under cathedrals. Legend says the oil for French kings, called the Holy Ampulla, was delivered by a dove during the baptism of Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks. You'd think a royal sephora would have been simpler. You creep closer as the bishop dips his fingers into a golden ampulla. The oil smells of balm, myrrh, and other exotic resins. It glistens as it drips down the king's forehead, temples, chest, and hands. You try not to stare, though the entire ceremony has the vibe of both a church service and a medieval spa day, yet this sacred oil was no harmless beauty serum. Rumors spread that anointing oils carried curses or divine retribution. If the oil dripped the wrong way, or spilled, or simply smelled off, medieval onlookers believed it foretold disaster for the king's reign. Take Richard III of England, for example. Chroniclers whispered that during his coronation, the holy oil dripped onto his robe in an unexpected pattern, seen as an omen of doom. Historians still argue whether this truly happened or whether the rumor was cooked up later by his enemies. Either way, Richard ended up under a parking lot, so, vibes were not great. A quirky tidbit: some kings demanded elaborate astrological charts be consulted before their coronation, refusing to proceed unless the stars aligned favorably. One French monarch reportedly postponed his anointing 3 times waiting for Mars to behave. Medieval power moves, sponsored by Mercury retrograde. As you peer around the cathedral, you notice how tense everyone seems. Priests grip their censers like weapons, nobles glance at each other with expressions that scream, "Please let this go smoothly." Because if a king botched his coronation, it could spark political chaos. Rivals might declare him illegitimate, foreign powers might invade, and rebels might sense weakness. That's a lot of pressure to pile onto one oily ceremony. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on anointing was genuine theology or simply a medieval marketing ploy. The idea that God himself selected a king was a powerful deterrent for anyone considering rebellion, or at least that was the plan. A chronicler once recorded how Charles VI of France was so unstable during his coronation that priests whispered prayers non-stop, terrified he'd collapse mid-rite. He didn't, but considering Charles later believed he was made of glass, the priest's concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Meanwhile, the choir continues singing, but your eyes drift toward the throne waiting at the far end of the nave. Its high back is draped with embroidered silk, shimmering under candlelight. You remember what's hidden beneath, flea-bitten cushions and possibly a secret chamber pot. Ah, medieval contradictions, the bishop now places the crown on the king's head. It's heavy, ornate, and probably still crawling with microscopic wildlife from Section 3. The king tries to keep his chin high, though his neck muscles are screaming in protest. A quirky tidbit: Henry VI of England was crowned King of France as a child, with a crown so big and heavy it kept sliding down his face. He sat there looking like a medieval toddler playing dress-up, hardly the image of divine rule. As the final prayers echo off the vaulted ceiling, you can almost feel the collective exhale from every courtier and priest. The oil didn't spill. The king didn't faint. The curse didn't activate, yet, but the tension never fully fades. Because in the medieval world, the line between sacred ceremony and political theater was paper-thin. One slip, one unlucky omen, and the newly anointed king might spend the rest of his reign battling rumors of divine disfavor. And speaking of royal dangers, you're about to meet some of the most bizarre, and occasionally lethal, pets ever to pace a palace corridor. You shuffle away from the incense-heavy cathedral, brain buzzing with visions of sacred oil mishaps and giant toddler crowns. But just when you think you've seen peak medieval weirdness, a piercing roar shakes the palace walls. You spin around, nearly tripping over your robes, and find yourself face to face with a lion. A real one. Its golden eyes fix on you as it pads past, its claws clicking ominously on the flagstones. Welcome to the utterly bonkers world of royal pets, because medieval kings didn't settle for lapdogs or budgies. Oh no. They collected exotic beasts the way modern billionaires collect sports cars, status symbols on 4 legs, or sometimes wings, that screamed, "I'm richer and crazier than you'll ever be." Mainstream historians confirm that kings kept private menageries filled with lions, leopards, bears, monkeys, and even elephants. These animals weren't just entertainment, they were living proof of a ruler's wealth, reach, and connections to far-off lands. Historians still argue whether kings genuinely loved their beasts or simply displayed them as political trophies. A quirky tidbit: Henry III of England famously kept polar bears in the Tower of London. The bears were allowed to swim and fish in the Thames, secured by chains so they wouldn't snack on passing Londoners. Nothing says royal pet like a giant predator with fishing privileges. You edge into a large courtyard where cages line the walls. Inside, creatures of every shape and size pace restlessly. You spot monkeys with mournful eyes, a lynx lounging like it owns the place, and a giraffe trying to fit its neck under an archway clearly not designed for giraffes. A chronicler once described a giraffe gifted to Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, as so tall that peasants fainted at the sight of it. Imagine explaining that in your medieval village gossip circle, but the king's fondness for exotic animals came with hazards. Medieval menageries were hygiene nightmares. The stench of animal waste mingled with rotting meat fed to the predators. Fleas and ticks hitched rides from beast to human, sometimes transmitting diseases. You suddenly understand why kings kept moving between castles. Historians still argue whether medieval zoos were early scientific curiosity or just vanity projects that threatened royal health. Given the number of bitten fingers and missing limbs recorded in royal accounts, you're leaning toward vanity project. As you tiptoe past the lion's cage, a keeper casually explains that the king occasionally staged battles between animals for entertainment. Lions versus dogs, bears versus bulls, spectacles so brutal that even hardened knights sometimes turned away. A quirky tidbit: King James I of England once tried to pit a lion against a porcupine. The porcupine won. The lion, humiliated and covered in quills, refused to leave its den for days. Medieval animal handlers, making the worst betting decisions since time immemorial. You freeze as a monkey scampers past you, snatching a golden goblet from a servant's tray. Medieval records are filled with tales of royal monkeys wreaking havoc, stealing jewels, biting courtiers, and flinging certain substances better left unmentioned, yet kings adored their unruly pets. Charles V of France doted on his pet parrot, reportedly spending more time chatting with the bird than with his ministers. Imagine an entire kingdom hanging in the balance while the king discusses cracker distribution. Historians still argue whether these animals offer genuine comfort to lonely monarchs or merely added chaos to already volatile courts. Given how often a royal pet ended up biting someone important, it's fair to suspect the latter. You lean over a railing and spot a crocodile sunning itself in a shallow stone pool. A chronicler claims that King Louis XI of France once owned a crocodile as part of his private collection. Medieval people believed crocodiles were living dragons, so naturally, owning one was the ultimate flex. A quirky tidbit: some royal beasts were given elaborate titles. Henry VIII's elephant was officially recorded as His Majesty's Most Noble Elephant, and received a daily ration of wine. Because of course it did. Beyond the spectacle, royal beasts could spark diplomatic incidents. Exotic animals were often diplomatic gifts, an elephant from an Indian sultan, a leopard from a North African ruler. If a king refused the animal, it might be seen as an insult. If the animal died shortly after arriving, it risked political tension. Historians still argue whether these exotic exchanges strengthened alliances or merely led to awkward explanations. When the giraffe inevitably keeled over in the English climate, suddenly, a deep growl vibrates the floorboards. The lion eyes you as if deciding whether you're worth the hassle. You back away slowly, promising yourself to never, ever criticize a king's choice in pets again, because as dangerous as plotting nobles or poisonous wines might be, nothing says medieval peril like a royal menagerie where one wrong move could cost you a limb, or your entire head. And speaking of heads, it's time you learned how medieval kings handled the slightly awkward problem of getting rid of royal enemies. You scurry out of the menagerie, heart still hammering from your close encounter with a lion who clearly hadn't read the "no snacking on guests" memo, but there's no time to catch your breath. Because while royal pets could nibble you to death, medieval kings reserved far more permanent solutions for their true enemies. So brace yourself, because tonight, you're about to stroll through the blood-spattered corridors of royal executions. Medieval kings ruled by divine right, or so they claimed, but that didn't mean they felt secure. Rebellion, treason, and even mild criticism could transform a royal court from glittering splendor into a grisly stage. Mainstream historians confirm that medieval monarchs used execution as both punishment and performance. Beheading wasn't merely a way to remove someone's head, it was a political statement. "Defy me," the king proclaimed, and your noggin could end up on a spike. Historians still argue whether executions genuinely deterred conspiracies or simply bred deeper resentment and vengeance plots. A quirky tidbit: some English kings ordered traitors' heads to be dipped in pitch before mounting them on London Bridge, so the heads would stay fresh longer. Medieval preservation methods, just another perk of royal power. You're ushered into a courtyard where a wooden scaffold rises above the crowd. The king himself stands nearby, cloaked in velvet, expression unreadable. A hush falls over the onlookers as an axeman sharpens his blade on a whetstone. The condemned kneels, trembling. The crowd holds its collective breath. Because even a royal execution could go horribly wrong. Consider Mary, Queen of Scots. Yes, she's technically post-medieval, but the same tradition applied. Her executioner needed 3 blows to finish the job, and afterward, her pet dog emerged from under her skirts, soaked in blood. Not exactly the kind of courtly entertainment anyone signed up for. Historians still argue whether medieval executioners were skilled professionals or simply local butchers handed a big axe and told, "Good luck." A chronicler describes one hapless axeman who bungled the beheading of Thomas Cromwell, whacking away for several swings while the crowd screamed. You suddenly realize that for medieval kings, executions weren't just justice, they were PR events that could backfire spectacularly. You glance around the scaffold and notice the royal standard fluttering in the breeze. Even the flags remind the populace that the king's authority stretched from divine oil to the executioner's block. A quirky tidbit: in France, a royal decree mandated that certain noblemen must die by sword rather than axe, considered a more honorable method. Because clearly the dignity of decapitation lies in your choice of blade. Beyond beheadings, kings had a full arsenal of grim options. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was reserved for traitors, especially in England. Victims were hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled, then cut into quarters. The pieces were displayed in various towns as a warning. Medieval tourism: come for the castles, stay for the body parts. Historians still argue whether these extreme punishments were driven by genuine legal principles or simply royal terror tactics. Either way, the spectacle left a powerful impression on the medieval public. Meanwhile, the royal executioner wasn't some random brute. Many were trained professionals, often inheriting the job through family lines. A quirky tidbit: one German executioner kept a journal listing all his clients, treating it like a twisted medieval resume. You edge closer to the scaffold steps and spot a sturdy wooden block stained dark from repeated use. A chronicler records how King Henry VIII's wives and Boleyn and Catherine Howard both met their ends on similar blocks, heads neatly severed as crowds gathered for the royal show, but executions could also be private. Kings sometimes ordered noble prisoners quietly dispatched in dungeons, far from public view. Chroniclers note that Edward II's demise may have involved just such a clandestine end, though, as we've already learned, historians still argue about every gruesome detail, and sometimes executions turned into pure theater. Kings like Richard III staged grand processions of condemned nobles, marching them through streets in chains before the fatal blow. It wasn't enough to kill an enemy, you had to kill their reputation, too. Historians still argue whether these humiliations were more effective than simply removing political threats quietly. Medieval monarchs seemed to believe that visible fear was the glue holding kingdoms together. A quirky tidbit: the phrase, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, became so notorious that later kings toned down its public spectacle to avoid traumatizing the populace too much. Small mercies: medieval style. As the axeman raises his blade, the crowd gasps. You squeeze your eyes shut, unwilling to watch. When you peek again, the crowd is dispersing, murmuring prayers, and possibly calculating which noble might be next, because in medieval times, one whispered rumor or forged letter could see you lose not just your head, but your lands, your titles, and your family's future. And speaking of family, brace yourself. Next, you're going to find out how royal bloodlines could be just as fatal as the sharpest axe. You leave the execution yard behind, still trying to shake off the metallic tang of blood hanging in the air. But as you slip back into the palace corridors, the vibe shifts yet again, because if axes and poison weren't enough, medieval kings faced an even subtler threat: their own family trees. Welcome to the ultimate royal paradox. For medieval kings, bloodlines were both a ticket to the throne and a loaded weapon aimed squarely at their skulls. You drift into a high-ceilinged chamber lined with family portraits. Dozens of solemn monarchs stare down at you, each one clutching a scepter or a sword. They look dignified, until you remember that half of them probably tried to murder the other half. Mainstream historians agree that royal bloodlines were a double-edged sword. Kings obsessed over producing heirs to secure dynasties, yet those same heirs could become deadly rivals. Historians still argue whether medieval kings were more terrified of foreign invaders or their own relatives. A quirky tidbit: medieval genealogists sometimes invented royal ancestors, claiming descent from legendary heroes or even biblical figures. French kings traced their lineage back to Trojan princes. English kings occasionally claimed a family tree sprouting from Brutus of Troy. MedievalAncestry.com was both impressive and suspicious. You inch closer to one particular portrait, King Edward IV of England, grinning faintly as though he knows a secret. Chroniclers hinted for centuries that Edward might have been illegitimate, sparking the infamous Wars of the Roses. A missing branch in the royal family tree nearly toppled the entire monarchy. Historians still argue whether Edward was indeed the biological son of his supposed father, or whether his existence was a political cover-up. One royal scandal, centuries of chaos. You step along the portraits, each king's lineage more twisted than the last. Kings arranged marriages like chess moves, forging alliances and plotting claims. Children became diplomatic bargaining chips, engaged as toddlers to secure peace. A quirky tidbit: young Richard II of England was married at age 13 to a princess only 6 years old. Because nothing says medieval romance like a wedding where the bride's favorite toy is still a doll. Royal marriages, however, were anything but peaceful behind closed doors. The palace was a hotbed of jealousy, infidelity, and suspiciously convenient deaths. Rumors flew that certain queens poisoned rivals, or even their husbands, to secure power for their own children. You passed the portrait of Isabella of France, the she-wolf of France. Married to Edward II, she ultimately helped depose her husband and ruled as regent for their son, Edward III. Imagine Sunday dinner in that family. Historians still argue whether Isabella was a ruthless schemer or simply a queen forced to survive in a violent political world. Either way, royal family reunions were probably tense. Next you spot Charles VI of France, whose bouts of madness led him to believe he was made of glass. During his reign, factions within the royal family battled viciously for influence, plunging France into chaos. A king who thinks he's glass is tragic enough, but combine that with power-hungry uncles, and you've got a full-blown medieval soap opera. A quirky tidbit: one medieval king refused to allow anyone to touch his royal shoulders, fearing that physical contact would somehow break the divine lineage flowing through his veins. Imagine trying to play royal tag and getting tackled by divine wrath. Royal bloodline wars didn't just shatter families, they shattered entire nations. The Plantagenets, the Capetians, the Valois, all these dynasties imploded under the weight of cousins challenging cousins for the crown. Historians still argue whether dynastic conflicts like the Wars of the Roses were inevitable due to flawed succession laws, or simply the result of individual ambition run wild. You're leaning toward both, but even kings with secure heirs weren't safe. A king's own children could turn against him. Henry II of England spent years battling his sons, who rebelled repeatedly. His son Richard the Lionheart even formed alliances with Henry's enemies. Medieval Father's Day gifts likely included daggers tucked into bouquets. You catch sight of a tapestry showing the Spanish Habsburgs, whose obsession with marrying cousins led to genetic issues like the infamous Habsburg jaw. Centuries of intermarriage left royal bloodlines riddled with health problems, infertility, and mental instability. Medieval monarchs often paid a high price for keeping it in the family. A quirky tidbit: King Charles II of Spain was so physically and mentally impaired from generations of inbreeding that courtiers whispered he couldn't chew food properly, and that his jaw dislocated during speeches. Medieval royalty, glamour, pageantry, and sometimes jaw unhinging at inconvenient moments. Historians still argue whether these hereditary health crises contributed directly to the fall of dynasties. Given how many kings ended up sick, childless, or completely bonkers, you're guessing it didn't help. So as you leave the portrait gallery, your head spins with the realization that royal bloodlines were far more curse than blessing, because in medieval times, nothing could end your reign faster than your own last name. And speaking of ending reigns, next you're about to explore how medieval kings obsessed over the afterlife, desperately trying to ensure that death wouldn't be the final betrayal. You emerge from the portrait gallery feeling slightly woozy, as if all those royal family trees have tangled themselves around your brain. But before you can clear your head, a priest steps out of a side chapel and beckons you in with a crook of his finger. "Come," he murmurs. "The king must prepare for eternity." And just like that, you find yourself plunged into the dim, echoing chambers where medieval kings wrestled with their ultimate terror, death, and what might come after, because for all their power, wealth, and armies, medieval kings lay awake at night pondering one dreadful thought: what if God was keeping score? Mainstream historians agree that medieval monarchs were deeply obsessed with salvation. For a king, death wasn't merely the end, it was a cosmic judgment day. Historians still argue whether this spiritual anxiety was genuine faith or simply a royal PR strategy to look pious while collecting taxes. A quirky tidbit: King Louis IX of France, later St. Louis, was so worried about his soul that he wore a hair shirt under his royal robes and frequently whipped himself in private. Medieval self-care routines were intense. You follow the priest into a candlelit chamber where monks chant solemn Latin hymns. In the center lies a massive wooden chest, the royal treasury earmarked for pious works. Because when kings sinned, and oh, they sinned, they tried to buy forgiveness with lavish donations, golden chalices for cathedrals. Entire monasteries funded from scratch. Kings even bequeathed lands to the church, hoping monks would pray for their souls for centuries to come. One chronicler joked that some monasteries held daily masses for kings whose names none now remember. Medieval crowdfunding at its finest. Historians still argue whether these donations genuinely eased a king's conscience, or were just hush money to the Almighty. You edge closer to the chest and peer inside. Jewels, coins, and glittering reliquaries catch the candlelight. Relics were a particular royal obsession. A splinter from the true cross. A vial of the Virgin Mary's milk. Kings collected these holy souvenirs like spiritual insurance policies. A quirky tidbit: King Louis IX collected the crown of thorns and built the dazzling Sainte-Chapelle in Paris to house it. The cost nearly bankrupted the royal treasury. But hey, priorities. Meanwhile, royal burial plans were equally elaborate, and sometimes downright morbid. Medieval kings commissioned ornate tombs years before dying, specifying how they wanted to be posed, what robes they'd wear, and even the facial expressions sculpted onto their effigies. Imagine booking your funeral photo shoot decades in advance. You wander into a side chapel where stone effigies of dead kings lie in eternal slumber. One king clutches a sword, eyes open as if still on guard. Another smiles faintly, perhaps hoping to charm St. Peter. A chronicler described how Edward I of England ordered his tomb inscription to proclaim that he'd continue conquering Scotland even from beyond the grave. Medieval kings, petty to the very end. Historians still argue whether royal tombs were acts of genuine devotion or just colossal flexes meant to dazzle future visitors. Either way, medieval kings spared no expense ensuring they'd be remembered in style. As you drift deeper into the chapel, you notice priests preparing a long scroll. It's a chantry roll, a list of prayers and masses to be said for the king's soul. The longer the list, the safer the royal soul, or so everyone hoped. Some kings even left money to pay monks to pray perpetually. Talk about a heavenly subscription service. A quirky tidbit: King Richard II endowed so many chantries that the priests began to complain they physically couldn't keep up with the prayer quotas. Medieval burnout is real. You watch as priests sprinkle holy water on a velvet coffin draped in royal insignia. The medieval funeral was a spectacular show, complete with torchlit processions, chanting choirs, and elaborate symbolism. Some kings ordered symbolic, heart burials, having their hearts interred in separate shrines far from their bodies. Historians still argue whether this practice was about devotion or simply a savvy way to leave royal, brand ambassadors scattered across the realm. A chronicler records how Richard the Lionheart's heart was buried in Rouen, his entrails in Poitou, and the rest of him at Fontevraud Abbey. The medieval IKEA approach to burial instructions, yet for all the splendor, kings feared one thing above all: eternal damnation. The priest beside you whispers tales of kings reportedly rising from their graves, howling with guilt. Superstitions claimed that sinful monarchs became restless spirits, doomed to haunt the earth until proper masses were sung. A quirky tidbit: one legend says King John of England still roams Windsor Castle, rattling chains in eternal penance for his misdeeds. Medieval kings, the original haunted house tour guides. Historians still argue whether these ghostly rumors reflected genuine belief or were clever tools to keep rebellious nobles in line. After all, nothing scares a would-be traitor like the threat of a royal specter dropping by for a midnight visit. As the chanting swells, you can't help but feel a chill. Because medieval kings may have worn crowns of gold, but in the end, they faced the same question as everyone else: when the final bell tolls, where will you go? And speaking of heavenly visions, you're about to discover how medieval kings tried to prove God was firmly on their side, sometimes in the strangest ways imaginable. You slip out of the echoing chapel, the monks chanting still thrumming in your bones. But before you can breathe a sigh of relief, a courtier appears, eyes wide with urgency. "Quick," he hisses. "They're testing divine favor." And suddenly, you're swept into yet another layer of medieval royal life, a world where kings didn't just rule by sword and law, but claimed to rule by signs straight from heaven itself, because in the medieval mind, a king wasn't merely a man with a crown. He was God's chosen vessel. And he had plenty of proof. Mainstream historians confirm that medieval monarchs leaned heavily on miracles, visions, and holy relics to bolster their legitimacy. The logic was simple: if God liked you, your enemies would tremble. Historians still argue whether these spectacles reflected sincere belief or were merely cunning propaganda tools to keep the masses compliant. A quirky tidbit: one medieval king insisted God sent him messages via a specific star in the sky. When the star went missing behind clouds, the royal astrologers panicked for days, convinced it spelled doom for the monarchy. Medieval forecasting, equal parts astronomy and sweaty guesswork. You're ushered into a vast cathedral, where a crowd has gathered to witness a royal miracle. The king kneels at the altar, hands trembling as priests bring forth a gleaming relic. Tonight, it's the alleged finger bone of St. John the Baptist. A hush falls as the relic is raised, glittering in the candlelight. The priests chant solemn prayers. Then, dramatically, the king touches the relic, and the assembled crowd erupts in gasps of awe. Did the king's pimple disappear on the spot? Did the relic glow faintly? Or is everyone just swept up in the moment? You'll never know for sure. Historians still argue whether these miracles were genuine supernatural events or carefully orchestrated spectacles. Chroniclers wrote of kings cured of blindness, deadly fevers vanishing overnight, or battlefield victories achieved after praying to a saint's relic. A quirky tidbit: Henry VI of England was credited with curing people of scrofula, a form of tuberculosis, merely by touching them. These ceremonies were called the royal touch. It got so popular that kings had to schedule mass, healing days, like medieval meet and greets. You inch forward as the priests proclaim the king's divine favor confirmed. Trumpets blare. Nobles drop to one knee. Servants weep. All of it aimed at proving one thing: God wants this guy on the throne. But miracles weren't limited to relics. Kings often invoked visions. Saintly apparitions allegedly appeared in royal bedchambers, delivering messages about battles, alliances, or which cousin to execute next. Chroniclers breathlessly recorded these visions as divine truth, yet historians still argue whether these visions were spiritual encounters or convenient political inventions. After all, it's pretty handy if St. Michael swings by your bedroom to confirm that, yes, you really should invade France. A quirky tidbit: Emperor Constantine supposedly saw a flaming cross in the sky before a crucial battle. Centuries later, kings across Europe claimed similar sky signs to justify their wars. Medieval divine PR, as effective as a modern press release. You glance upward through the cathedral's stained glass. A shaft of moonlight suddenly cuts through the clouds, illuminating the king in a perfect spotlight. The crowd gasps again. Is it God, or just good timing? Historians still argue whether natural phenomena like eclipses or comets were interpreted honestly or deliberately twisted to serve royal narratives. A comet streaking overhead could be either a sign of God's blessing, or the doom of an entire dynasty. Depends who you asked. Outside the cathedral, a group of monks debates another powerful tool in the royal spiritual arsenal: relic collecting. The more relics a king possessed, the more holy backup he could claim. Kings paid staggering sums for tiny bone fragments, vials of holy oil, or threads from the Virgin Mary's cloak. A quirky tidbit: one king spent a fortune acquiring a feather supposedly from the Archangel Gabriel's wing. Chroniclers solemnly recorded its presence in royal ceremonies, though one skeptical courtier noted it looked suspiciously like a goose feather. Relics weren't just kept in dusty vaults. They were paraded through towns, displayed during coronations, and even carried into battle strapped to royal standards. The message was clear: God rides with us, and you'd better not disagree. Historians still argue whether this blending of faith and politics strengthened kingdoms or sowed seeds of disillusionment. After all, when a king boasting divine favor lost a battle, or his head, it left the faithful with awkward questions. You wander back outside as bells toll across the city. The crowd disperses, still murmuring about the king's miracle. Meanwhile, nobles are already strategizing how to spin tonight's event for maximum political advantage, because in medieval times, a king didn't just wear a crown. He wore the mantle of divine purpose, cloaked in signs and wonders, even if some of those wonders were suspiciously goose-flavored. And speaking of power games, next you'll discover how medieval kings tried to keep a lid on dissent, by creating a whole new breed of royal spies. You drift away from the cathedral square, your mind swirling with relics, flaming crosses, and suspiciously goose-like feathers. But before you can collect your thoughts, a shadowy figure in a dark cloak materializes beside you. "Shoo," he whispers. The king has eyes everywhere. And that, my friend, is your gentle introduction to medieval kings' secret weapon, the royal spy network. Because while kings claimed to rule by divine right and heavenly visions, they also knew the grim truth: mortal enemies were lurking in every shadow, and sometimes in the next seat at dinner. Mainstream historians confirm that medieval kings maintained extensive networks of informants, messengers, and double agents. Paranoia wasn't optional, it was the price of the throne. Historians still argue whether these networks were genuinely effective, or merely created more chaos and mistrust. A quirky tidbit: Henry VII of England spent huge sums hiring spies to infiltrate every noble household. The man practically invented the Tudor-era rumor mill, and he'd have loved Twitter. You're led into a narrow passage lit only by flickering torches. In a cramped room, scribes hunch over parchments, copying intercepted letters. Wax seals lie broken on tables. The air smells of ink, sweat, and secrets. Here, royal spies read private letters, eavesdropped in taverns, and bribed servants to reveal which baron was grumbling about taxes, or plotting a coup. One chronicler wrote that a careless word in a wine-soaked feast could cost a noble his lands, or his head. Historians still argue whether kings' spy networks kept realms stable, or simply fueled endless suspicion, false accusations, and paranoid purges. You peer over a scribe's shoulder as he translates a letter from Latin. It's an innocent note about sheep trading, except hidden between the lines are coded instructions to smuggle weapons into a rebellious province. Medieval espionage, where even livestock might spell treason. A quirky tidbit: medieval spies sometimes used invisible ink made from lemon juice or milk. Heat the parchment, and a secret message would appear. Eat your heart out, James Bond. You move through another chamber where courtiers whisper news gathered from distant lands. Because spies didn't just sniff out domestic traitors, they also served as the king's eyes abroad. Diplomatic embassies doubled as espionage hubs, collecting juicy intelligence on foreign alliances, troop movements, and scandalous royal love affairs. Historians still argue whether diplomatic missions were ever truly peaceful, or simply a polite cover for high-level spying. Considering the number of ambassadors caught passing secrets, your money's on the latter point. One chronicler describes how Edward III of England planted spies in the French court disguised as monks. These holy men reported back on military plans, and, presumably, which French nobles preferred snails over frogs. Essential state secrets, obviously. A quirky tidbit: some medieval spies disguised themselves as wandering minstrels, traveling freely between courts under the guise of entertaining songs. Next time you see a lute player, be suspicious. But while kings relied on spies, the system was far from foolproof. False accusations were rampant. Rivals framed one another to eliminate competition. An innocent noble might wake up one morning to find himself labeled a traitor based on forged letters or planted rumors. Historians still argue whether medieval kings genuinely trusted their networks, or merely used spies as political tools to crush dissent. Given how often spies switched sides for the right price, loyalty was always in short supply. You're shown a stack of secret black lists, recording nobles under suspicion. Names are scrawled beside ominous notes: speaks against taxes, favors rival claimant, has suspicious number of pigeons. Because in medieval times, even your poultry could get you killed. A quirky tidbit: King Richard II kept a secret network of informers to report on seditious talk. Chroniclers recorded that some nobles got hauled before the king simply for calling him vain. Medieval cancel culture. Now with axes. In one shadowy corner, an agent demonstrates how messages were hidden in hollowed-out candlesticks or sewn into clothing hems. Spies even trained carrier pigeons to fly secret routes, though sometimes the birds defected to enemy castles. Feathered traitors everywhere. Historians still argue whether these elaborate plots were necessary, or whether kings simply fanned paranoia to keep nobles too busy spying on each other to rebel. You exit the chamber, your mind spinning from tales of invisible ink, coded sheep letters, and minstrel spies. Because for medieval kings, power wasn't just about armies and crowns, it was about knowing everything, before anyone else did. And speaking of knowing everything, next you'll explore how medieval kings kept their courts entertained, and distracted, with a steady dose of music, feasts, and the occasional deadly tournament. You emerge from the secret tunnels, blinking into sunlight, your brain swirling with invisible ink and treacherous pigeons. But before you can process how deeply paranoid medieval kings were, a fanfare of trumpets blares through the courtyard. "Make way," cries a herald. The king commands a feast. And just like that, you're swept into the glittering chaos of medieval royal entertainment, a world of feasting, music, and festivities where kings dazzled their courts, and sometimes accidentally killed a few people along the way, because ruling medieval kingdoms wasn't just about wars and spies. Kings knew that a well-fed, well-entertained court was less likely to plot rebellion. And nothing distracted nobles from scheming quite like a party big enough to bankrupt a small country. Mainstream historians confirm that medieval kings threw legendary feasts lasting days or even weeks. The tables groaned under roasted boar, swan in elaborate pastry shells, and jellied fish molded into shapes that defy both god and culinary sanity. Historians still argue whether these extravagant displays were genuine hospitality or calculated propaganda to showcase royal wealth. A quirky tidbit: at one feast, King Henry VIII reportedly served an entire peacock covered in its own feathers and sprinkled with gold leaf. Medieval plating: 10 out of 10 for presentation, maybe a 2 out of 10 for practicality. You're herded into a colossal banquet hall, its vaulted ceiling dripping with silk banners. Minstrels strum lutes, tambourines jingle, and a juggler tosses flaming torches dangerously close to the king's beard. The smell of roast meats and sweet spices fills the air until you feel a little dizzy, and also a bit concerned for your eyebrows. A chronicler recorded how King Charles VI of France held a masquerade ball called the Bal d'Ardens. Guests dressed as wild men in flammable costumes of pitch and feathers. Naturally, someone's torch got too close, and several dancers went up in flames. Historians still argue whether this was simply a tragic accident, or a sign that medieval party planning really needed a safety committee. A quirky tidbit: medieval feasts sometimes featured subtleties, sculpted sugar creations depicting entire castles, mythical beasts, or political scenes. One English king commissioned a sugar model of his own coronation, complete with tiny edible bishops. Medieval fondant cakes have nothing on this. Beyond feasts, kings turned to music and entertainment to keep their nobles loyal and distracted. Troubadours performed tales of chivalry. Poets composed verses praising royal virtues, even if said virtues were questionable. Historians still argue whether these performers genuinely admired the kings or simply sang for their supper. Given how many songs rhyme with "generous patron," Your guest leans toward the ladder. In a corner of the hall, acrobats perform handstands while a bear on a chain tries to dance in time with the music. You recall from Section 8 that royal beasts often doubled as entertainment. Nothing says regal like a bear in a fancy hat. A quirky tidbit: medieval kings sometimes hired fool societies, groups of jesters who performed entire comedic plays lampooning court politics. The bravest jesters mocked the king himself, though there was always a risk the next day they'd be missing from the roster. But for the ultimate royal entertainment, look no further than tournaments. These mock battles were part sport, part lethal proving ground where knights bashed each other with lances in front of roaring crowds. Historians still argue whether tournaments were genuinely chivalric events or just an excuse for nobles to settle scores while wearing shiny helmets. You find yourself ushered outside to a grand tournament field. The king sits in a raised gallery, velvet canopy billowing in the breeze. Trumpets sound as armored knights thunder past, lances leveled. The crowd erupts in cheers, and occasional shrieks when a knight crashes face first into the dirt. A chronicler once described a tournament where Henry II of France was struck in the eye by a splinter from a broken lance. He lingered for days in agony before dying. Medieval sports, not exactly low-risk hobbies. A quirky tidbit: some kings forbade tournaments outright, fearing they might foster dangerous rivalries or accidental coups. Yet nobles insisted on them, because how else could you show off your shiny armor, and your willingness to concuss a cousin? Historians still argue whether tournaments helped kings maintain control or simply gave ambitious knights a practice run for civil war. You're starting to suspect the answer is both. You watch as a knight dismounts and bows deeply to the king, who tosses him a golden chain in reward. The crowd applauds. Underneath the pageantry, though, you sense an undercurrent of tension. Because in medieval courts, one day you're the star of the feast, and the next, you're on the scaffold. A quirky tidbit: some feasts ended with drinking games so fierce that entire noble factions passed out, leaving the king free to scheme without their interference. Medieval diplomacy, occasionally conducted between hangovers. As the sun sets over the tournament field, torches flare to life. The king rises, signaling the end of festivities. Servants scurry to clear tables, mop up wine spills, and shepherd the bear back to its cage, because while medieval kings loved a good party, they also knew that behind every goblet of wine, behind every lute chord, the dangers of power still lurked. And speaking of lurking dangers, next, you'll follow the kings into the shadows of political plotting, where survival meant always staying one step ahead, or ending up on the wrong end of a blade. You shuffle away from the fading glow of torches, ears still ringing with the echoes of trumpets and the faint roar of a bear who'd rather skip the afterparty. But as the laughter and music die behind you, another sound rises: hushed voices, footsteps sliding cautiously across marble, the faint scrape of steel, because as much as medieval kings adored feasts and fanfare, power was never safe. Not even for a crowned head. Tonight, you're stepping into the labyrinth of medieval political intrigue, where secrets, betrayals, and backstabbing were as common as roasted swans on a banquet table. Mainstream historians confirm that kings spent as much time plotting survival as they did ruling their realms. Courts were nests of vipers, filled with nobles eager to whisper poison into royal ears, or into royal goblets. Historians still argue whether medieval monarchs were true masterminds or merely pawns manipulated by clever courtiers. A quirky tidbit: one chronicler claimed that Edward II of England was so clueless about plots swirling around him that he'd cheerfully invite conspirators to dinner, completely unaware they'd spent the afternoon plotting his downfall. Medieval networking, dangerous for your health. You're guided into a small council chamber, its heavy wooden doors barred from within. Around a long table, nobles lean forward, eyes glinting in the candlelight. Maps are spread across the surface, covered with little flags marking fortresses and borderlands. This is where the real kingdom was ruled, not always from the throne, but from private rooms like this one, where alliances were forged and destroyed with a single sentence. Historians still argue whether kings controlled these secret councils or if cunning advisors manipulated royal decisions. Given how many kings ended up deposed, you suspect the advisors sometimes had the upper hand. A chronicler describes how King Richard II of England trusted a handful of favorites so completely that they ruled in his name, sparking noble rebellions. Nothing stirs medieval tempers like a royal clique hogging all the power, and the royal purse. A quirky tidbit: one of Richard II's advisors reportedly convinced him to raise taxes by claiming peasants were hiding coins under their floorboards. The result? The Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Medieval PR failures, occasionally spectacular. You lean closer as a noble points to a spot on the map and hisses, "My lord, if we move troops here, we can cut off the Duke's supply lines." Another retorts, "Yes, but he's married to the king's cousin." Medieval politics was a constant balancing act between ambition and blood ties. Historians still argue whether kings genuinely cared about justice, or simply used legal charges as convenient excuses to remove rivals. Accusations of treason, heresy, or witchcraft often appeared just when a powerful noble grew a little too powerful. A chronicler once recorded how King Louis XI of France kept his enemies locked in tiny iron cages suspended from the ceiling. Each was barely big enough to stand or sit, but never lie down. The filletes, as they were called, were medieval timeout corners with added torture. A quirky tidbit: in some courts, nobles resorted to secret poison rings, tiny devices that could deliver a lethal dose into a cup of wine. Next time someone offers you a toast, you might want to politely decline. You slip back into the palace corridors, where courtiers huddle in corners, whispering behind fans and embroidered sleeves. Information was currency. A single rumor could shatter alliances, spark wars, or doom an entire family. Historians still argue whether medieval monarchies fell because of genuine political crises, or because court gossip snowballed into unstoppable chaos. You pass a tapestry depicting a royal council. In the foreground, the king sits sternly on his throne. Behind him, advisors lean in close, one hand discreetly on a dagger. Medieval artwork was occasionally subtle, and occasionally just honest. A chronicler tells how Charles the Bold of Burgundy suspected everyone around him of treachery. He once executed several nobles based on a single anonymous letter, only to discover the letter was forged by an enemy seeking to thin the duke's ranks. Medieval HR policies were lacking. A quirky tidbit: some nobles communicated in elaborate coded gestures. One courtier might scratch his left ear to mean, "The king is angry," while a tug at the beard might signal, "Don't trust the steward." It was basically medieval charades, but with higher stakes. You find yourself outside the royal bedchamber, a place both intimate and perilous. Kings were at their most vulnerable in bed. Many rulers feared assassins slipping in under cover of darkness. Thick wooden bolts, private guards, and secret escape passages were standard bedroom accessories. Historians still argue whether kings' paranoia was justified, or simply fueled by too many nights steeped in gossip and red wine. Given how many monarchs met sudden, mysterious ends, you're not blaming them for triple locking the door. You peek in and see the king pacing, unable to sleep. His crown glints in the dim lamplight as he mutters calculations under his breath. Who's loyal? Who's plotting? In the end, even a king must gamble on trust, knowing one betrayal could end everything, because in medieval times, the true horror wasn't just battlefields or royal beasts. It was the knowledge that, no matter how grand your coronation, you could fall overnight, and with that, your harrowing journey through the horrors of medieval kings draws toward its end. But don't slip away just yet. Let's slow things down together as we drift into a gentle wind down. The shadows of medieval palaces fade behind your eyes now, and you feel yourself sinking deeper into the softness of your pillow. The clang of swords grows distant. The roar of lions and the roar of tournament crowds melt into a hush. Even the whispering plots of scheming nobles grow quiet, like leaves rustling far away. That you're safe here, far from dark corridors and flickering candlelight. The velvet draperies of royal halls dissolve into soft darkness, and your breath becomes slower, longer, each exhale drawing away the weight of poison chalices, iron cages, and royal paranoia. In this gentle quiet, the horrors of medieval kings become echoes of another world, a place of golden crowns and secret passages, of opulent feasts. And shadows where danger lingered. But none of that can touch you now, your eyelids grow heavy. Your limbs sink into the bed as though you're being wrapped in the finest silk. Even the memory of pitch-dipped heads on London Bridge loses its sting, becoming nothing more than a peculiar story told around a medieval hearth. Tonight, there are no conspiracies lurking in your chambers. No watchful spies behind velvet curtains. Only the hush of the room around you, the soft pulse of your heart, and the gentle knowledge that you've traveled far, without ever leaving your bed. So let the flickering torches fade. Let the royal drums fall silent. Let every troubled king find peace at last, and you too, drift into sleep, safe and calm, as the kingdom of dreams opens its gates for you. Sweet dreams.